So how are you keeping these days, Connor?
Really well, Stephen. Great to see you.
Thanks for coming along. So we're all still unfortunately living in an environment at the moment that's tough, what with COVID. But you were mentioning that you've come across a situation within workforce management that you'd like to share.
Yes, Stephen, I would. And thanks for the opportunity to discuss this. So we have a large technology company as our client in Dublin, Ireland. And due to the pandemic, that particular company has workers all over the world now. So they were working in Ireland, they're employed in Ireland by this particular company, and they're back in their home country. So in some cases they're in Germany, workers are in Germany, Netherlands, Poland, Australia, Canada, you name it, they're there. And that is actually a good thing, right? Because the company's still working strong, the workers are happy, they're engaged, etc. However, there is a hidden risk and a hidden issue there that not many organizations are aware of. So those workers that are now back in their home country of origin, they're in the Irish tax net, they're paying their employment tax, their employer is paying their employer taxes. On the face of it, that's all well and good. However, in some cases, those workers have been in their home country for past 183 days, and that throws up a number of tax-related risks for their actual employer, some of which relate to something called permanent establishment. I'm going to do my best to make that as simple as possible. Some relate to employment law and employment taxation. Others relate to immigration status. So there's a number of risks we'll focus on as we go through this.
So that's an interesting point you make there, Connor. I never really would have thought about that before.
Yeah, Stephen, it really relates to those unintended consequences. We believe remote working is a really good thing, right? And there's a number of countries that do as well. So for example, Barbados has introduced a 1-year visa for digital nomads. And, you know, frankly, who doesn't like the idea of working on a beach in Spain for your company that's headquartered in Ireland or USA? But it's fair to say that there's significant risks attached to this new way of working that the pandemic has forced upon us.
Yeah, on the face of it, it seems risk-free. You know, all I need is a laptop and a phone and I can work anywhere.
Yeah, Stephen, I think you're right to call that out. On the face of it, it seems so easy, straightforward, seamless. It works for the organization. It works for many organizations. We are big advocates for remote working here at CXC, and we help some really amazing companies manage this global and distributed remote workforce. But, and there's always a but, there are some risks and complications and potential costs that come with doing international remote working non-compliantly.
So what sort of risks are we talking about, Connor?
So there's two main tax-related risks we want to focus on, Stephen. The first one relates to something called permanent establishment, and the second one relates to payroll and employee and employment taxes. Mm-hmm. So what is permanent establishment? Permanent establishment is where an Irish organisation has Irish employees in the Irish tax system paying taxes at source, mm-hmm. now working from their parents' bedroom in Dusseldorf in Germany. Mm-hmm. And after a 6-month period or 183 days, it's quite possible and quite likely that the German tax authorities could make a reasonable case that that organisation now has permanent establishment in Germany.
All right. Okay.
So what does that mean? Well, in its simplest terms, that means that that organisation has presence and substance there, mm-hmm. and therefore their corporate tax profits could be taxed in Germany.
Really?
So if you're an Irish company paying corporate tax of 12.5% and you're paying higher tax in Germany, you're not going to want to take that risk. Okay.
Of course, yeah.
And the second one, Stephen, relates to payroll and employment related taxes. So again, let's use this example of Irish employee now back in Germany working from their parents' bedroom. The German tax authorities could make a reasonable case after 183 days that that worker should now be in the German tax net, and therefore that worker should be paying German employee taxes, and also the end user or the organisation in Ireland should now be liable for paying German employment taxes. So why is that problematic? Well, it potentially opens up the door for double taxation, right, for the worker and for the organisation in Ireland. But also, if that particular organisation doesn't have a legal entity or payroll in Germany, how are they going to do that? And how are they going to do that compliantly? So it's a massive potential problem for those sort of organisations. And although I've referenced Germany, the same principle applies in most other countries around the world. So if, for example, you're an organization that has these workers that were previously in your country, so Ireland or UK, and they're now dispersed around the world, this is something that you need to be aware of and potentially take action around.
And so earlier there you were talking about other risks, immigration and potentially employment laws?
Correct, Stephen, and they're quite big ones to consider as well. So let's look at immigration. So now you've got this remote workforce. They're in Barbados, Germany, France, UK. They're providing the work, they're providing the service. A key point to be aware of is, does that worker have the right to work or perform their services in the UK, for example? Are they a UK citizen? Do they have a UK working visa? If not, that's particularly problematic for that particular company that's employing those workers, because that leaves them open to fines. So the starting fine in the UK for failure to check an employee's right to work, or if they don't have the appropriate right to work status, is £10,000.
Wow.
And the only way is up from there. And in addition to that, an organisation could face criminal prosecution, which is significant in itself. The second risk relates to labour law, a topic that's very close, of course, to CXC's hearts and within our skill set and expertise. But the labour law point is a really important one to make, Stephen. So again, let's look at that Irish company with workers now in Germany. The German tax authorities have said that their previous Irish employee that's now in Germany must be a German employee. Within Germany,
After that 6 months?
After that 6 months, correct, Stephen. The German employee will now have German employment rights. Now, if you compare German employment law with Irish employment law, the German employment law is much more pro-employee, and consequently the employee will have much greater rights around things like dismissal, paternity leave, maternity leave, and that's really problematic for organisations because they lose that flexibility that they previously had, and of course they don't have the HR policies and processes in place to properly manage this within their organisation.
Okay.
And of course, that's where someone like CXC can come in.
Would health insurance be a risk as well?
Yeah, health insurance is certainly one to consider and one to be aware of. So let's look at that Irish example again. So you've got Irish employees that might have Irish benefits, so they might have a private healthcare policy through their employer in Ireland, for example. They're now back in Germany. They're essentially trapped in Germany because they can't travel to Ireland due to the pandemic. So the key question is their health insurance portable? Can they bring that across to Germany? In most cases, the answer to that is no. And that poses a problem in terms of how organisations then provide similar benefits to that employee now in Germany.
I suppose as well too, because as you mentioned, it is a pandemic, so there's probably more risk of their health
Exactly.
in that situation.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Stephen, and that's something that they really need to be aware of and put measures in place for.
Right, okay. And in regards to intellectual property?
Outside permanent establishment and employment taxes, this is a big, big risk for companies. The reason for that is, Stephen, if permanent establishment is confirmed, like I mentioned earlier, that could trigger a different tax treatment for that organisation around their intellectual property. So they might lose some of the benefits and credits that they've accrued in a country like Ireland,
Right.
in a more higher tax environment such as Germany. And then, of course, how do they protect their intellectual property when the workers are in a third country where they might be in a different IT environment or different Wi-Fi? How do they protect?
Like working from home?
Exactly. You know, they're no longer on their corporate internet, their corporate Wi-Fi. So how do they manage and protect their IP, and what policies and procedures do they have to mitigate that risk?
So that's a lot of things to consider, Connor. What advice would you give to organisations?
So there's three pieces of advice, Stephen, we wish to give. The first is conduct an employee audit. So what do we mean by that? Well, the first thing they need to do is establish where are their employees now working. So if they're working back home in Germany or Netherlands or wherever country they originated from in the first place, they need to establish that. The second critical point that they need to establish during this audit is how long have those workers been back in their home country?
Sure. Yeah.
And this 183 days that I've mentioned a number of times, that's the key trigger point. And at that point, once organisations determine that, that's when they need to take action. So the second thing we would recommend is, once the audit's complete, Stephen, is that the organisation engages local or expert tax advisors or legal advisors to determine how they're going to manage and mitigate the risks that we mentioned. So permanent establishment, labour law, employment tax, intellectual property. The third thing they could do, of course, is bring those workers back to where they should be, back to where they're employed. However, I think it's an obvious point to make. That's problematic during the pandemic because they might not be able to get them back due to all the travel restrictions. And what they could do potentially is engage a third party such as CXC or other companies to actually manage that risk for them.
So I guess, Conor, then, if a company had a lot of workers in a lot of countries, that's going to be a fair amount of work. You're saying CXC can reduce that workload?
Correct. That's where CXC really come into our own, Stephen. So we operate this model already. So on behalf of some pretty impressive large companies, we already manage their global remote distributed workforce. And we've got 65 entities around the world where we can provide outsourced employment services. So if we look at Germany, for example, we could actually employ those workers on behalf of that Irish company, ensuring that tax risk and those tax risks that I mentioned earlier were mitigated, as well as issues relating to immigration and intellectual property protection.
So that all sounds really useful, Conor. What if somebody wanted to get in touch to find out more?
Please email conor.heaney@cxcglobal.com.
Thanks a lot, Conor. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Stephen. Great to see you.